for sticking around. We are now going to go to questions from members of council. Councilman Brooks, you're first up.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to start off a little different and just staff folks from CPD, can you please just stand if you were a part of this deal for 3 years? Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. President, I didn't ask them to clap. I was just going to recognize them. But thank you for the clap. I think a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in there. So we gave Gaspers and Sholwalter a little time. I just wanted to make sure we had extra time for the people who spent time on this. And so, Brad Buchannan, I'm going to call you up first. Hi, Brad. How you doing? Good to see you. Brad, you had 3 minutes. You've been, you kicked this thing off. And so I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything else you would add to kind of the chorus of individuals kind of talking about this plan.
I think a lot of it's been said. I think a lot of it's been said very diplomatically this evening. But, successful cities grow. And that's why we've been growing the last 20 years. That's why we've seen such amazing investment in the city the last 7 or 8 years. And while that change is a painful and hard thing, just the pace of the change is hard to consume. The folks, the planners, the citizens, the task force get that, but refuse to give up on the promise of what is great about Denver. And it's not perfect, and things change. But this plan, I think, authentically addresses the impacts to what that change in pace of change and the realities that if we continue to sprawl outside, if we continue to not allow density around transit and to increase even transit-oriented density, we, as it was spoken by one of the speakers tonight, will absolutely just increase the carbon footprint, spend more time in single-occupant vehicles. And so we need to think very creatively about how we handle both of those things, how we value open space in our city and green space and natural space in our city. And I don't think it's magic. And I think that blueprint and the Denveright suite of plans get to the heart of it, that looking around equity and density and affordability and design quality, because density can be a very livable place when when design is valued at the highest.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to call up our co-chairs, Joe Noble and Kimball Crangle. You all got paid $0. And so I wanted to ask a question, but I also wanted to give you as much time as you wanted to talk, or as much time as the president will allow for you to share some of your feedback. I guess the leading question that I'm going to give you all is, I represent a district where there's a lot going on. There are a lot of people who are pro-density, a lot of urbanists, a lot of folks, but there are a lot of folks who don't want to see a tiny home in their neighborhood. They don't want to see an ADU in their neighborhood. How did you all balance this over the last 3 years of being progressive, having a vision and having a progressive vision for the future, but at the same time recognizing that this growth is scaring a lot of folks, this growth is hard for a lot of people? How'd you balance it?
Sorry, we always have to talk to each other first. So I'm going to let Joel talk about the neighborhood plans and small area plans because he's so eloquent about that. But what I'd like to share about is the neighborhoods of Denver. I've had I love Denver. I moved to Denver in 2003, so I'm a transplant from Kansas. And when I moved to Denver, I moved into the Harvard Gulch neighborhood, and I found a city that was very welcoming to me. I didn't know many people. I actually didn't know anybody in Denver. And I had choice about where I wanted to live. Even though I was making a pretty low wage at the time, I was able to find a community that I felt comfortable in and that I could take the bus to. I didn't have a car. I couldn't afford a car downtown to my job at 19th and Grant. And I've moved a lot. I like to move. I like to experience new places. So I've had the privilege to live in La Alma Lincoln Park and Congress Park and West Wash Park and Harvard Gulch. And my office is in the Golden Triangle. I have office downtown. Most importantly, I do work in affordable housing, and I've worked for Denver Housing Authority for 6 years and led the Mariposa redevelopment in La Alma Lincoln Park. I've worked in Lowry when I was the executive director of the Lowry Community Land Trust. I've built great projects in Westwood, in Globeville. We just acquired the Colburn Hotel and preserved it from flipping to market rate in Cap Hill. And the work is big. It's overwhelming at times, especially when you see the families that have lived in Denver for generations, and all of a sudden, they've lived in Westwood in a home that meets their needs, had family members sharing their household with them, and all of a sudden their property or their suite of properties gets purchased, and they've got 30 or 60 days to move and find somewhere else to go. Well, where do they go? Where do you go for a family, and how do you uproot your children and your lives like that? This is big, and in Denver, this is what we're facing a lot. We have that extreme. We have seniors that want to downsize and can't. They can't age in place. We have parks that are in neighborhoods that aren't safe to walk around at night or even during the day, and people think, oh, well, there's green space right there. Well, you walk around that. See how you feel. We live in a great city, but we live in a city with a lot of challenges and a lot of inequity. And until we face that head on, which I think we're doing now in Blueprint Denver, and we're acknowledging institutional barriers that have existed for a long time, and we're saying redlining might not exist the way it used to, but it still is prevalent in many of our neighborhoods. Until we face that head on, we're going to perpetuate the inequity that exists. So when I look at Blueprint and think about, well, this person doesn't want an ADU and this person doesn't want a tiny home, I think what we can say collectively is that we want to live in a safe place with amenities and walkability where our kids are safe and where our parents are safe. And I want, my family to be able to afford to move into town. And I want my neighbor next to me to be able to stay put and not feel like they're being forced out because of property tax increases. That was the Denver I moved to in 2003. Not all of that, but some of that. And Denver's changed a lot. And Denver's worth fighting for. It's worth saying we're going to grow. We should keep our doors open. But there's a way that we can grow that's welcoming and safe and comfortable. And I think it's worth it. And I think our neighborhoods want many of the same things. It's how we accommodate and funnel growth in a way that's respectful, tolerable, and sustainable. So that was way too much talking.
Thank you, Councilman. I think I'll just have 1 point micro, 1 point macro. At the micro level, there was a strong emphasis here on neighborhood plans, because to take the vision and the values and the goals and the strategies in Blueprint Denver and make them hit the ground, these plans leave a gap. They aren't regulatory. So it will be up to council, it will be up to CPD, working with the communities to say, okay, we've agreed as a city, these are the tools we have in the toolbox. Now, how specifically does it meet the ground in your neighborhood? And those neighborhood plans should guide the regulations like zoning. I mentioned at the end of my comments that it's my hope and my belief that the thing people will have on their lips when they talk about Blueprint Denver for the next 20 years is complete neighborhoods and complete networks. And that's a deceptively powerful framing. Complete neighborhoods is going to challenge people to have discussions amongst themselves as they're doing their neighborhood plans to say, what do we have completeness in and what don't we? Does our neighborhood support a range of age levels? Does our neighborhood support a range of income levels? Does our neighborhood have things to walk to or only residences? Completeness on a lot of dimensions, and hopefully that will generate a lot of very good conversation that leads to neighborhood plans that lead to more complete neighborhoods and networks. And serving on the Denver Planning Board, I look forward to challenging staff as they bring us neighborhood plans. The first one will be the Far Northeast Plan, and say, all right, this plan is going to be adopted under the new Blueprint Denver if Council acts tonight. How does this plan provide complete neighborhoods? Show us that the conversations have occurred, and I'm very confident they will. Zooming out to the macro, I was reminded the other day about April 2017, the April 2017 public meeting here. It was the Growing a Better Denver game, for those of you who attended that session. And the question is, how much growth do you accommodate and where? For 20 years, we've had this idea that you put growth near transit. So much so that people who are not involved in planning and don't come to public hearings at night, you ask them where should the growth go, they'll say, well, near transit, of course. We've got that in Denver. But where and exactly how? At the task force level, we talked abstractly about growth strategy. But it was at this April 2017 meeting in a high school cafeteria that people broke up into different tables. You sat by people you knew and you sat by people you didn't know, but you had 6 or 8 people there, and you played with playing pieces, and you worked out where should growth go. And staff went and blended those together as one way that the community was expressing itself that later got refined into the maps that people could comment on online. So at a macro level, how did we decide where to grow? We asked people to very tactily show us, leave aside abstractions, where should people go? And the centers and the corridors that are in the plan emerged.
That's great. I think, Mr. President, that's enough question. That really helps me to understand each of your perspectives on some very tough questions that we're dealing with on City Council, so thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Brooks. Councilman Espinosa.
Joel, can I ask you to stick around? Just sort of a follow-up to your response there, because I've heard the term a lot about complete neighborhoods, particularly in your response. Is it fair to say that we're not doing a very good job right now of compelling complete neighborhoods as an outcome?
I think as we've heard testimony tonight, some neighborhoods are certainly more complete than others. We talk about walkable, bikeable places to live where you don't have to drive to do your normal trips of life, certainly.
Yeah. So the thing that I've been struggling for 4 years from this dais is sort of a massive amount of upzonings on Fox Island and the limited ingress and egress for that part of Glowville. And so one of the things is I've said from here as well that we should treat it as an island, right? Because, you know, a doctor should be present there, a vet should be present there, a grocery should be present there. Sort of all the things that you would need to sort of live on an island should largely be present there. That, I think, would those elements be consistent with this idea of a complete neighborhood, or?
I think that's the kind of conversation I hope happens in the neighborhood plans, is as people talk about complete and let that very positive idea roll around in their minds and then meet each other and compare their ideas of completeness, the vision for that neighborhood should emerge. Now, there's market realities as well. A plan or city zoning can't compel a business to open there if there's no market for it, if they don't. We've seen that with grocery stores. The community wants a grocery store, but it's not economically viable. So it also raises the opportunity to have two-way dialogue with the community and with planners to say, if we agree we want that, then as a practical reality, a prerequisite of that is this, for instance, rooftops for grocery stores.
So it's fair to say that and are you going to be around for the Blueprint Denver discussion?
I will be here till we're done.
Great, because these are sort of more in that realm on the recommendation side of these things. I'm trying to figure out how we would get in these recommendations to those outcomes. Because I don't disagree with the idea of complete neighborhoods, because those are the things we need to stick to get to all 6 vision elements. But I'm worried that at least you acknowledge the market element to this is how these documents will get used by the market and the timetables associated with it, will play out if the market continues in the way that it's been.
I'll certainly be around for any other questions.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilman Espinosa, this is our question session for both. This was a
both.
combined hearing. So once we move out of this, it'll only be comments. So if you have questions,
I
then
do then.
now would be the time for both of them.
All right, Joel, then let's go into into that, right? So the final commenter, Mr. Stephen Chester, made some very eloquent remarks about sort of the disadvantaged elements of our community. I think those align with Vision Element Goal 5 very well. Reduce involuntary displacement of residents and businesses. But then in the strategies, it says advance a comprehensive approach, and this is really to staff or to Joel, advance a comprehensive approach to mitigating involuntary displacement that includes expanding economic mobility, creating new affordable housing, and preserving existing affordable housing. In the recommendations, underneath item 5 on the implementation matrix, there are 3 items listed, but they only address major city projects and this potential. I'm going to disregard the fact that they reference OED, which is an agency an office that doesn't exist anymore, so I hope we're not sending them somewhere that doesn't exist. But, how is it that integration? How is it, how do we address the situations that might happen that are like Jefferson Park and the communities that I represent that didn't have major city investments or projects, but exhibited major involuntary displacement? Which tool, which recommendation are we putting forward in this plan to address that level of displacement?
And I'm sorry, could you clarify which plan you're reading? Because there's very similar recommendations in both.
Yeah, so I'm actually
Were you reading from both?
referencing Goal 5 in the comp plan, which then goes to Blueprint Denver recommendation 5 in the general, and then has an actual implementation strategy in the matrix in the back. So I was actually talking about the matrix because that's sort of the nuts and bolts of what's going on.
So let me start with the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan has an implementation matrix too. Do you have that in front of you?
No, I didn't have that.
So I think part of the challenge here is that you're jumping from one plan to the other. So let's start with comprehensive plan, because Goal 5 that you pointed out in the implementation matrix for the comprehensive plan has strategies there that go well beyond just major investments. So there's, in addition to the one that you already read, advance a comprehensive approach to mitigating involuntary displacement that includes expanding economic mobility, creating new affordable housing, and preserving existing affordability. We also have stabilized residents and businesses at risk of displacement through programs and policies that help them stay in their existing community, and evaluate city plans, projects, and major regulatory changes for potential to contribute to involuntary displacement. So I want to just start there. The comprehensive plan does have more because its scope is much broader. I think you might also have a outdated version, because we did go through and change all references from OED to DIDO, because we agree with you. We want to point people in the right direction. Although now we'll have even new challenge ahead of us to update the matrix and point people to a new Department of Housing and Homelessness that just will be created, because we worked really closely with our partners in what's now DIDO, Economic Development and Opportunity, to focus on a really comprehensive approach to displacement. Blueprint Denver was trying to take a little more of the lens of a land use and transportation plan, not the whole involuntary displacement picture, which is going to involve a lot of programs and policies that go well beyond zoning and land use and transportation investments. So the blueprint recommendations, if they might feel a little more limited in scope to you, that was actually intentional. We were trying to really link where involuntary displacement comes together with land use and transportation decisions. And the comprehensive plan, our hope there was that it has broader policies that cover other things, because to your point, yes, there are a lot of neighborhoods that may not have those big investments, but we still want to stabilize residents there. And then also point you to Housing Inclusive Denver and some of our other plans that have much more detailed strategies on what some of those tools might look like.
So where I'm struggling, which is how do these plans, especially if and I apologize because my Excel spreadsheet is cut off, so I didn't know the first half of the
Sorry about
things.
that.
How these two things that are in conflict, seemingly, which is recommendations in certain places for increased density based on some transit notion that may or may not exist, marries with the market reality, which is that somebody could go in there and justify that creating the opportunity for increased density in an area, even at a low scale increased density that would be sort of commensurate with the form of the surrounding neighborhood, would still result in the displacement of occupied housing. Would we look at, is there anything in here that prescribes us going forward looking at the existing property, its use, and if it's occupied before moving forward with the rezoning to sort of address the displacement, or are we still agnostic to who's there and what's there right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that generally the approach that we've taken, this is based on a lot of input from people working on this topic, trying to prevent involuntary displacement in Denver, as well as a lot of research we did into other communities. Denver, actually through DIDO as the lead, is part of a Policy Link network across the city. Policy Link's a national nonprofit that brought together 10 cities. We had to apply. We were accepted into the network to be part of what they called an anti-displacement network, and we've learned a lot from peer cities through that. And I'd say through that research, as well as people working here, generally the approach has been the best way to try and solve these problems are through policies and programs that aren't going to be site by site. So one, small rezoning, we also don't always have the data to really understand what the displacement impacts might be from a small site. So you've seen in the language in Blueprint Denver, the focus is on how do we take the involuntary or the vulnerability to displacement map that's in the plan and integrate that at a minimum into our larger scale rezonings. I don't think we do have a good model for saying that every single kind of smaller parcel coming through would go through the kind of analysis that you're bringing up. But I think if you look more comprehensively at the plan recommendations, when we would do the analysis for plan consistency that'd be part of any rezoning, we would certainly be considering, particularly if it's an area that's vulnerable to displacement, do we have tools or programs in place in this community to address those needs? So it might not be the burden of one particular rezoning, but we would certainly want to be thinking about that community as a whole.
Does this plan, would you say, would it address existing conditions that we created? So I have a lot of sub $500,000 homes that are being ground up for multi-unit, well north of $500,000 on resale. Again, will this plan? Are we basically saying what we've done in the past and what is existing are there any recommendations that compel us to sort of revisit existing fabric and put in new tools to address involuntary displacement? In some cases, it's weird, right? It's not involuntary. Some people are actually choosing to leave that formerly affordable unit and make a slight windfall off of that transaction. But now we're creating a Denver that doesn't have those affordable units. So which recommendation addresses essentially the situation that I have in West Sloan's Lake, or East Sloan's Lake, or along Tennyson Street?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say there's several recommendations, but I guess a couple that I would highlight is that we have very strong language around the importance of missing middle housing. That's something we heard about a lot from the community, but we also heard a lot that the exact scenario you described, basically where you, in the name of housing diversity or new units riding the neighborhood, are actually losing affordability, is a huge concern. And so we very specifically have the recommendation that where we're going to look to enable gentle density in our neighborhoods, that we should seriously consider things like income restriction for the added units that are kind of a bonus. So that's one tool we're looking at. We also have a strong recommendation to look at more incentives for affordable housing across the city in all of our transit-rich areas. So doing something, at least for now, given state law, since we can't just do a lot of requirements, the model is, well, let's do more of what we've done at CPV Auraria and 38th and Blake. It might not be that exact same model because we want to figure out how to apply it to some of our lower density areas as well. But the concept of saying, because we heard really strongly from the community that there was actually more acceptance than you might think around density or adding more to a neighborhood than what's there now, but only if in exchange for that it comes with affordability. And so we have recommendations saying, let's look for more ways to incentivize that, kind of have a base, but then an incentive that comes with doing more affordability. I think those are the kind of strategies that would hopefully help prevent some of the situations that you mentioned.
Do we have a timetable for that? Because we've spent 3 years developing this document. How fast can we get into that realm? Because these are when I talk about Tennyson, those are areas that are not in the NPI process. They're not going to a neighborhood planning process. Right. This conversation may or may not happen for the better part of 6 years.
Right. Okay, well, I'll interestingly something. Okay, so yes, great point. Honestly, on a lot of this, we should have started it 3 years ago, right? So I think I want to be clear, this implementation of those ideas, we actually really tried to set them up to be a citywide conversation, so you don't have to wait for a neighborhood plan. And the incentive for affordable housing is one of the zoning code amendments we'd like to kick off this year as major implementation item. We do a very robust community process around a major change like that, so the process would probably take 1.5 to 2 years, but we're hopeful to start it very soon if the plan is adopted.
Okay. Thank you.
And then did you want to?
I just wanted to add one quick policy to your question, Councilman. Policy 3 in Blueprint Denver on housing, Policy 3 on page 83, is incentivize the preservation and reuse of existing smaller and affordable homes. And a strategy there talks about implementing zoning tools that incentivize the preservation of those homes. So I think that's really to one of your points.
Yeah. Councilman Espinosa, you good for now?
No, I'm chuckling because this is one of those laments I've heard from the community, which is that recommendation is 3 is in the housing recommendation, not the general recommendation. It's a lot of recommendations, sort of. I would be happy to skip unless there's no one else asking.
I have a couple other people in the queue.
Go ahead.
All right, Councilman New, you're next up.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Sarah, first I want to thank you and Dave for the great work, leadership y'all did, and the co-chairs and all the volunteers. It's really good to see all the massive positive support that we heard from the public tonight. And that was, I didn't know what was going to happen. And I was so glad to see that there was that overwhelming support. So congratulations on a great job done.
Thank you.
I want to talk about a couple of issues strictly from a resident's perspective, issues we've been talking about. We've talked, and I appreciate your responses to it. Let's talk about rezoning. On pages 66 to 67 is the rezoning process. The rezoning has probably been a concern or anxiety of a lot of residents in neighborhoods and about what's going to happen, especially in the NPI process we're going through. That's been some concern about for certain neighborhoods. But in looking at the top of 67, it describes the rezoning process, but it doesn't mention neighborhoods. It doesn't mention resident involvement in the rezoning process. Can you sort of describe what the role is of neighborhoods and residents in the rezoning process so that everybody have a clear understanding of what that is?
Sure, yeah. So neighborhoods play a really important role of informing the analysis that staff and the planning board and city council do to evaluate whether a rezoning, the first criterion that it would get reviewed against is it consistent with our adopted plans? And as you can imagine, sometimes there's a bit of subjectivity or disagreement sometimes around whether it's consistent with the plan. And that, I would say, is one of the main roles that we see the public really informing and improving the process. So the neighborhoods have a lot of opportunity. We have a required notification of any registered neighborhood organization at the time that we receive an application. And then again, for planning board and city council hearings, thanks to Councilman Espinosa, we also now have a requirement for postcard mailing to go to all owners within 200 feet of the property for both of the hearings. So there's lots of advertisement, and through that we see a lot of neighborhoods get engaged, sometimes to the extent that they even help change or influence what the proposed rezoning is, what the applicant goes for, because of that neighborhood input.
Great, that's great. So being left out of this process, that doesn't mean they're being excluded. They're still going to be a valuable component to the rezoning process, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Looking at the future places, that map, that we talked about, and even though, that maybe areas of change and stability is simple, but, sometimes residents like very clarity. They like concise, simple things, They don't have the knowledge about sophisticated tools to figure it out. And that was the thing about areas of stability and change was really good. And this map here shows the future. It shows the changes, and I like the color-coded version. It shows you what the zoning is going to be. How does a resident know what's going to change? How do they know what area how much change is occurring, and how do they go about that kind of discussion by looking at this document?
Yeah, great question. We're actually thinking about developing a companion piece that would really kind of be a flow chart almost of, because the pieces, the steps you would go through is you could look at an existing zoning map, which we have online, and see what the zoning is today. You could also look at existing land use, because sometimes the zoning doesn't match the land use that's there. Then you'd look at the plan map that calls for the future, the aspiration, and to understand if there's a difference, you would go to the section of the plan that describes, usually we have a whole paragraph describing what that future place is. So if it's a community corridor in the urban context, or if it's a community corridor in the suburban context, and we have different scales of those corridors. And so it's kind of about going to the plan, finding what we say is appropriate for that type of place, and then comparing it to what's on the ground today. And I think you've had some good ideas about how we could make that a little clearer for people to understand, and we're going to explore how to do that in the web version of the plan.
Okay. They'll have somebody to come to that they can actually see in what a zoning change is going to be recommended.
Yeah, possible. Exactly. Like, see if there's something that would support a change in zoning. Yeah.
Great. I love the implementation matrix. We talked about that, and I've been loving to see this come. I've been hoping we have that in every one of our plans. It's great. And we talked about some things, and I especially like the priority section and the responsibility section. I mean, I'm a purist when it comes to some of this. I mean, we're missing the action plans, and most important, the resources. The money is not there. So that's the thing that I think, and I know that you're limited, and I just want to know, did you have discussion with the finance department as we're going through this 20-year plan about resource that could be applied? Because I see that we've done that in Go Bond in 2017. We had resources applied, and I know we're working on a 6-year CIP plan. We've got resources applied. Somebody can estimate some of the things. Could you have any discussion at all about the resources to make sure you can implement this plan?
Yeah, it's a great question. We did. What was actually really valuable about doing the Denveright process is that we aren't the only ones generating a bunch of recommendations, right? Okay. So you throw in the transit plan and game plan and the ped trails plan. There was actually a lot of discussion around wow, this is a lot. It's the right things to be asking for, but we also want to talk about different ways we might implement. So yes, there were strong discussions on that, and that included thinking about the existing tools we have, like the ones you mentioned, certainly bonds and our CIP every year, but also there's some ideas in the plans about needing to explore other ways that we might be able to find the resources needed to fund a lot of the ideas.
Okay. I pulled this out of the old Blueprint Denver Museum. This was the guide that everybody loves. I mean, it's that executive summary document of 27 pages from several hundred pages. It's a great thing that the public can really sink their teeth into and look at and see the essence of what happened in Blueprint Denver. The thing that I would encourage you to is the priorities. What are those key 10 to 20 priorities that are going to make a difference for this city, And I hope that you'll include that in there so they can see that. Because you look at the implementation matrix, and there's a lot of the strategies are just ongoing. It says ongoing. It's not new things that the public needs to be aware of that they may not be aware of ongoing too, but still, the new strategies are the ones I would think they're going to make the difference, I would hope. So I just encourage you and hope are you planning on having a sort of a document like that?
Yeah, I think, we have the starting point of our executive summary already, but I think you raise a good point that maybe there's a middle ground between the executive summary and the full plan, so we can definitely look at that, yeah.
And if you had top priorities, I'm sure you can do maybe for 10 years. It's so hard when you get out to 20 years, but
yeah.
At least it would give the public an idea of what the future is going to hold, so.
Yeah, it's a great point, and that's certainly part of what we want to do with the annual reporting, and our goal to keep this a living document is do a better job, of organizing that matrix and showing these are our priorities and how are we doing on actually implementing them.
Well, thank you. You did a great job. Congratulations again. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman New. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. President. Maybe David or Sarah, either one of you, could handle this question. But I heard one of the witnesses state, and I want to maybe I didn't hear it correctly, but that ADUs would not be owned they had to be owned by primary resident, and which implies that an ADU could not be owned by an absentee owner of the primary residence. Is that true? Are we contemplating that? And if so, how would we enforce that? Or did I hear that incorrectly? I think it was Mr. Rohrbaugh.
Yeah.
Who said
So the existing Denver zoning code has language speaking to how accessory dwelling units can be used today, and you either need to be the primary resident needs to be occupying either the house or the accessory dwelling unit.
That's in the current zoning
That's
code.
in the current zoning.
Okay, because I know there was a concern in Westwood as the Renaissance project there developed more ADUs that they could turn into investment properties and whatnot. So we're not contemplating changing that.
Correct.
Okay. What is the status of existing neighborhood plans? Would they now were this to pass, would they be considered automatically as supplements to these new plans? Or is there a cutoff to them? Because we've dealt with plans that are 25 and 30 years old. And then if so, which I assume is true, what would there be a foreseeable occasion where a recommendation in the new blueprint would override guidance in an existing neighborhood plan during a rezoning hearing or application process?
Sure. So I'll start the ordinance for the comprehensive plan, which is what the neighborhood plans are a supplement to, includes the list of all the supplements. So if it gets adopted tonight, it will include all the current small area plans that we have.
Okay. So if there is a conflict in the guidance in blueprint and the neighborhood plan, how would staff resolve that?
I would say there's not a straightforward answer to that. We actually have that challenge today sometimes already, right? And so you've probably seen rezonings before you where we've legally there isn't something that clearly says this plan always trumps this plan based on year it's adopted or its scope. So we consider with the same amount of weight what both plans say, but we also will acknowledge sometimes, particularly if one is 20 years old.
Correct.
You know, oh, okay, well, that things might have changed. We also sometimes acknowledge, well, this plan took the time to dive into a deeper level in this area in a way a citywide plan can't.
Right.
So it really depends on the situation. We always have to consider both plans. They both legally need to be considered, but how we address it would vary.
Sarah, do you know, standing here right now, do you know if any of the plans are adopted by reference? Do you know of any of them that have conflicting recommendations?
Oh, I wish that I was cool enough to know the recommendations of all these plans.
No, you don't. Nobody does.
I mean, the list here, I don't have the total count, but it's,
right.
you know, it's well over 70 plans, and some of them were adopted well over 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm going to venture to guess that there might be some things in there that aren't consistent.
I don't have to worry about that in my district because I've never had one, but I'm getting one now. And finally, is Ken Schreppel here still? He was sitting over here. Did he leave? Okay. David or Sarah, maybe you could answer this. Something that Ken said kind of set off a little anxiety in the pit of my stomach, and maybe I misheard him, but I think he was talking about the suburbs of Denver as opposed to the suburban areas of the city and county of Denver. My council district is entirely suburban context right now, but he seemed to say that suburban areas are antithetical to complete neighborhoods as envisioned in Blueprint, and David and Sarah know well because of our many back and forth conversations and emails, and especially in the last few weeks, that I have a great deal of anxiety over a one-size-fits-all or homogenizing all of our neighborhoods to be complete, maybe in the same way when the differing characters and contexts between urban edge, all the way down to suburban might call for different and more discrete approaches. How does CPD view, does CPD view suburban context areas as antithetical to complete neighborhoods? And if not, which I'm hoping you'll say no, you don't, how would suburban context be treated when trying to declare that this is now a complete neighborhood?
Sure. I'll start and then let David chime in too. You are correct. We very much see suburban neighborhoods as part of what makes Denver great. And we had a lot of people that live in suburban neighborhoods participate, coming to community meetings as well as some task force members. So you're very correct there. And I think it depends on the strategy. I'll hit a couple, and maybe David in particular might want to talk a little about transportation because that's a big component. But it's interesting because we don't want to, this gets to the equity a little bit, we don't want any neighborhood to feel like it has a lower bar because of its context, right, in terms of being complete.
Right.
But so there are basic amenities that we think no matter what context you're in, downtown to suburban, everybody should have, including things like transit. But we also recognize what that's going to look like and what the kind of the standards are. So, for example, the expectations of how many services you should be able to walk to in your neighborhood or how close a lot of high-frequency transit is going to vary by context. And we're very much aware that in the suburban context, we'll need a nuanced approach.
I'm very happy to hear you say that. Because definitely we are not complete when it comes to mobility. Mobility looks different in all the different contexts.
Yeah, I think the plan in its context-based approach is very intentional about how suburban parts of the city need to be complete in their own way. And so just for example, in the equity concepts, the access opportunity, we looked at different distances to access different types of centers and corridors, and it is different in a suburban setting to reach a regional center or a community center than in a urban neighborhood. So we're very cognizant of that. And I think it's also important to note that we have a lot of recommendations on how to think about how our suburban context can evolve over time. And there's a lot of opportunities in some of our corridors that are very auto-oriented today. And we'll still need to accommodate the auto in the future, but also with a transit investment along some of those corridors, like Federal, for example, how could we see infill at some of those large parking lots, et cetera, that makes a more walkable and transit-friendly community.
Thank you. That's all, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Flynn. Councilman Espinosa, you're back up.
So I want to thank David for, if anyone was watching Ludi, you saw me sort of question the vulnerability that I just was mentioning, neighborhoods without, statistical neighborhoods that have never had plans, and basically asking you guys to consider having language that in those areas that have never gotten any sort of major scrutiny from the city to have customized, that be the appropriate place where customized zoning be used, and to get these outcomes, because we talk about transitions, right? But there's nothing in the zoning code that requires transitions other than, the relationship to to protected districts. That said, where you directed me was page 73. I hope that page number hasn't changed. Again, in the general recommendations. But I'm worried because it's the last line in item recommendation B. So David or Sarah, because that line is an afterthought in that second paragraph, and it's right next to this big blue bold box that talks about the challenges of custom zoning, and we have policy that is averse to custom zoning, and in the Denver zoning code it talks about essentially a lack of wanting to use custom zoning. Are we still pointing everybody in the direction of base zone districts? Because the thing I was asking for then, and I'm going to still ask for that now, is rather than have it be a tag-on sentence that says custom zoning tools are most effective when a standard zone district does not exist to implement the adopted plans for an area, why can't we just pull that out, do another bullet point, and say custom zone districts, and I'll say it, shall be used when a standard zone district does not exist to implement the adopted plans in an area, because this is the only adopted plan. This will talk about transitions. This will talk about equity. This will talk about all the elements, the vision elements. We don't have a zone district that does that today.
You do have the current page and the current language.
All right.
So, yeah, it's a great point. I would say that we're trying to strike a balance between acknowledging when it is completely appropriate to use custom zoning, which, as you've seen, there's been a lot of custom zonings that have come through council recently, and it's definitely not the policy to always steer people away from it. Say the starting point is there a standard zone district? That's the intent of having the form-based code with the context-based approach, is to start with, we have this vast menu of districts. Is there something there that can get us, if not all the way there, then very close? But if there's not, then there's certainly an appetite to discuss custom zoning. And I don't think that the language here is trying to set us up to say that we don't want to do that in the future.
But haven't you seen developers basically be averse to approaching something when there's that many red flags telling them not to do something like that? Because I have had conversations with developers that don't want to approach that because CPD essentially advised them not to approach a customized zone district.
Yeah, I would say that's not something we hear a lot about. I feel like a lot of the applicants we work with are usually pretty open to wanting to just have a very successful process. So whatever is most likely to get them to get through the zoning criteria and showing plan consistency, as well as community support. And it is true. I mean, there's a reason why the language is in here. We are trying to recognize, not just because of the development community, but also even neighborhood residents. You know, we have people in Cherry Creek East that we've heard from most recently saying, you know, we really want to support as much as we can getting rid of old code zoning and having to do kind of site-by-site negotiation because they have a neighborhood full of PUDs. So we're trying to balance the desire to have predictable, straightforward zone districts that implement our plans, but also recognize sometimes the custom zoning is an appropriate tool.
Is CPD aware of the hubbub right now, whether it's fact or fiction, about the Home Depot on Fox Island at 41st and Fox Station?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by the hubbub, but I'm aware that there's a proposal to build one there, yes.
So the hubbub that I'm referencing comes from the fact that, yes, repeatedly I talked about and staff acknowledged that there were no minimums, right? So a zone district that allows 30 allows 1.
Yeah.
And if we look at the Globeville neighborhood plan, which is only now 5 years old, it doesn't contemplate big box retail. It contemplates something much more dense and much more mixed use. And so that's what I'm talking about, is we could take an MX30 or MX20 or whatever we have there and put the minimum there. And that's a custom zoning. And basically have precluded a big box retail, single-story big box retail project. I don't know that it's going to be that. And so that's how we can get plan objectives, whether they're this plan or NPI-generated plans, but only if we tell people that, no, if we don't have a zone district that compels the outcome that is envisioned, we will tweak the zoning so that we do. Why not state that very clearly, that our objective here is an equity component. We want to mitigate displacement. Therefore, we're going to have a housing component within a requirement within this distance to the TOD. We need a neighborhood serving retail, so we're going to have a retail component. Why not put that in there?
Well, I think overall I would just say that we feel like the best way to address those kinds of issues, like do we need minimum density requirements next to transit, which I point out land use built form, general recommendation number 2 in Blueprint Denver, that's what it's all about. How are we going to address the equity that you mentioned? Those things are best addressed by more comprehensive approach, an amendment to the zoning code, creating zone districts that accomplish what we need. If you start doing it every site that comes in, site by site by site, not only does it add a lot to the process, you don't necessarily end up with consistent results. So one landowner negotiates this outcome. The next landowner negotiates this outcome. The next landowner negotiates this outcome. And now in an area where you want one kind of comprehensive outcome or playing field, site by site, you've negotiated something differently. I'm not saying we still have done, particularly for large rezonings, we have used custom zonings or other tools like development agreements to get to the outcomes that we want when we can't get it fully through standard zone districts. But I guess my point would be we have other tools that we're trying to use to get those outcomes. It's not just through a custom zoning.
I don't think that CPD should fear the uniqueness of our areas, right? Town of Highland developed one way. Denver developed a different way. Auraria developed a different way. And they sort of came together and turned into something beautiful. And Lowry's standards are not the same as Stapleton standards, and they're not the same as downtown standards.
Well, I want to be clear. I'm sorry if that was unclear. Totally agree with you. I didn't mean to imply that it has to be the same solution for the entire city or half of the city or whatever. But I mean, like you brought up Fox Station. When I was saying a comprehensive approach, I mean for an area. So it's not one landowner at this point compared to this landowner over here, but it's all within a half-mile radius, has completely different rules.
But we have that's what's frustrating about those rezonings, right, is we had an adopted plan, and it envisioned a certain negotiated outcome that the community envisioned. But the things that you heard me say time and time again was that this plan, there's nothing about this rezoning that compels any of these outcomes that the neighborhood sort of envisioned that are the justification for those rezonings. And somehow, to the idea of complete neighborhoods, we need to figure out how to make these tools deliver that. And until we have zone districts that do, I'm saying it should be a requirement when you're going to map to these new places, a new zone district that has no precedent in any existing plan because they don't exist. That should be a condition whereby we do have that neighborhood discussion. And yeah, it is a one-off, and CPD seems averse to doing that, to putting that in the language. And then with all 3 places stating that customized zoning is essentially a big taboo, don't do it because it's hard to implement, is antithetical to getting the outcomes of complete neighborhoods in areas that don't have a complete neighborhood already. That's the real beauty of Northwest Denver. Would you not agree? And why it actually scores so low on need for plan is because it actually was a complete neighborhood. It developed around fixed rail transit. And so the infrastructure was already there in the built environment and the walkability of it. I mean, that's why it scores better than Lowry and Stapleton on plan need. And that was done without that holistic one-size-fits-all. And I think there's benefit to that, and I wish we would codify it. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilman Espinosa. Seeing no other questions, I have what I hope will be a quick one for you, David. Thank you for all your work with the West Wash Park Neighborhood Association, although I know you met with them a lot of times. There was a letter that they submitted. They read, into the record just on some things where they're, I think they were saying, we reinterpret it this way. You're saying that's not what it means. This means the same. Can you just confirm that the issues that they had in the letter, I won't go through one at a time unless you want me to, that the assurances that they were looking for just in terms of what the language read and how it would be interpreted, that you guys got that ironed out and that was accurate?
Absolutely, yeah. So I was able to read their letter and the 4 different bullet points on the assurances, and I agree with how they've written that. There was a dialogue between us to make sure we were understanding the interpretation of how the plan was written on those points, and it is a fair way to assess how the plan is applied to West Washington Park, and we'll look forward to working with them in the future.
Thank you very much. All right, seeing no other questions, the public hearing for Council Bills 302 and 303 are closed. Councilman Kashmann, would you like to formally offer your amendment to Council Bill 302?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Microphone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the Council Bill 19-302 be amended in the following particulars. On page 1, line 24, strike April 10, 2019 as 201900012 and replace with April 23, 2019 as 201900012A.
It has been moved and seconded. Comments by members of council. Councilman Kashmann?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. So in 2019, as we prepare to consider the documents that will guide planning in our city over the next several decades, we must be clear on what the challenges are to our civic well-being that these documents must address. Some challenges affect some neighborhoods, some affect our entire city, some extend even further. As the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has elevated concern over continuing warming of our atmosphere to emergency levels, it's critical that whatever plans we implement hold the need to mitigate our civic impact on global warming and protection of our planet and its resources as a prime directive. I fully support the 6 vision elements around which Comprehensive Plan 2040 and Blueprint Denver have been organized: equitable, affordable, and inclusive, economically diverse and vibrant, strong and authentic neighborhoods, well-connected, safe and accessible places, healthy and active, and environmentally resilient. While sustainability directives are present in numerous places throughout both plans, it became clear as I examined the documents that climate change needed to be given more prominent placement as an area of primary concern. I would like to thank David Gaspers and Sarah Sholwalter of Community Planning and Development for their partnership and willingness in finding the prominent placement we sought, and Tom Herod of the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment for his assistance in fine-tuning the wording of the amendment. These plans are indeed aspirational in nature and do not include precise directives in most cases, but they will, in fact, provide grounds to inform future discussions by clearly stating the priorities by which the people of Denver felt future development should be guided, along with increased emphasis on pedestrian safety on our streets, the need for affordable housing for all Denver residents, and long overdue attention to equity in the application of all our plans. Denverites to come will know that in 2019, the citizens of Denver and this council, when stating priorities, declared our intention to preserve not just a livable city, but a habitable planet for future generations. As stated before, the purpose of this amendment is to allow for inserting a sentence on page 51 of the comprehensive plan under the environmentally resilient introduction.
Thank you, Councilman Kashmann. And I just want to thank you for bringing this forward. I think this is critically important. I'm excited that you brought it forward and thrilled to support it. Seeing no other comments, Madam Secretary, roll call on the amendment.
Kashmann.
Aye.
Black.
Aye.
Brooks.
Aye.
Espinosa.
Aye.
Flynn.
Aye.
Gilmore.
Aye.
Herndon. Aye. Kniech. Aye. Lopez.
Aye.
New.
Aye.
Susman.
Aye.
Mr. President.
Aye. Madam Secretary, please close the voting and announce the results.
12 ayes.
12 ayes. Council Bill 302 has been amended. Councilwoman Susman, we need a motion to pass as amended.
Certainly. I move that Council Bill 19-0303 be placed upon...
Sorry, we're on
wrong one.
02 still. Yep.
0302.
I move that Council Bill 03... Where is it? 0302? Be passed as amended.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Comments on 302. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. President. Are we going to do them individually or in a block?
Individually, because we've just amended this one. Now we're going to vote on adoption of comp plan, and then we will, Councilman Kashmann will put forward his amendment of blueprint, and then we'll vote on blueprint.
Okay, thank you. I have remarks that were aimed at both. So should I do those now?
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Okay. So this is for both comp plan and blueprint. And so I strongly support so much that is in these plans, particularly the intentionality with which they take on historic systemic inequities among different populations and different neighborhoods. I like the emphasis on developing design requirements, especially in my suburban context with its emphasis on improving pedestrian access. When I walk to my King Soopers, I can walk on the sidewalk up to it, but there are no sidewalks from the driveway, no sidewalks lining the driveway into the shopping center, so we walk in the driveway with the cars. I'm also extremely grateful to the planning staff and its responsiveness, particularly to my district in Southwest Denver. A little more than 2 years ago, when Colorado Heights University was forced to close and they put the historic Loretto Heights campus up for sale at my request, David and Sarah and the core staff from CPD organized ad hoc one of the very first general public meetings to gather neighborhood input, not only regarding the campus and vicinity, but especially in every Southwest Denver statistical neighborhood, none of which had ever had a community-driven, city council-approved neighborhood plan. I was very concerned that this large redevelopment site coming on the market right at the beginning of Blueprint's rewrite without any neighborhood-level plan. And I hope that this had some small part in shaping the characterization and recommendations for the suburban context areas of the city into which my entire district falls. My district, in my estimation, already reflects a lot of the values expressed in Blueprint and in comp plan, at least as far as residential, if not in mobility. We have, as the draft Blueprint concedes, the most varied types of all neighborhoods. Southwest Denver has greater diversity than many neighborhoods in terms of population, incomes, and access to opportunity. It has a higher percentage of households of color than are represented in the city as a whole. The maps in Blueprint of the changes in non-white households since 1990 show clearly that my council district is one of the only areas of town where households of color have increased, while the overall percentage of households of color in the city as a whole and in our gentrifying neighborhoods has decreased. We're the part of Denver where people are moving to buy homes when they're gentrified out of other areas. My single-family neighborhoods are where households of color increasingly found that they can own a home and build wealth and equity. So at least in my estimation, but the plan leaves me uncertain going forward, whose estimation will matter when it comes to guiding density and change. Because of the highly aspirational and frequently unspecific nature of the plan, I can't sit here today and be certain whether the character of Southwest Denver will be preserved or disrupted by these plans. While I can interpret the recommendations as supporting preservation of character, I also see that 10 years down the line, when none of us is here any longer, this plan is vague enough that it can be substantially disruptive when interpreted differently than what I and my neighborhood leaders and residents have in mind right now. For instance, one of the recommendations in comp plan is to ensure city policies and regulations encourage every neighborhood to provide a complete range of housing options. At the statistical neighborhood level, my district already meets this, but in discussions with staff, I have a concern about applying that recommendation at a micro level, which the plan might lead to. There's a huge area of apartments and row houses a few blocks east of my house. My constituents don't want single-family houses scraped off to build multi-unit structures in their midst, as they have seen elsewhere in town. But this plan can support that. Their biggest fear was don't let happen to our part of town what's happened in Highland and North Denver and Jefferson Park and Sloan's Lake. I spent the past few weeks reaching out to discuss this with numerous neighborhood leaders and constituents, and to a person, I heard great anxiety that these new plans could lead to the kind of unpopular change that has disrupted some other parts of town. Almost illogically, many places where we've added density in an effort to preserve affordability are now some of the most unaffordable and gentrified parts of town. Meanwhile, in southwest Denver, a full 40% of dwelling units are in multifamily developments. As expected in the suburban context, though they are found in their own spaces, not interwoven in the same blocks as is common in the urban core that developed that way over decades. My own subdivision sits astride large multifamily developments of apartments, condos, row houses and townhouses, duplexes, and a few fourplexes. Blueprint's guidance could be used, however, to justify the insertion of fourplexes into suburban blocks of single-family homes, and my constituents have told me they don't want that. In fact, I believe in my Marston neighborhood, a majority of the dwelling units are in multifamily developments of all types. The recommendation to allow ADUs as a use by right in all residential districts also conflicts, in my opinion, with the guidance to preserve the character of suburban context neighborhoods. We had a person who lives on Raleigh Street testify about her ADU. The folks here who spoke in favor of ADUs everywhere have talked about how well they fit into urban contexts, but not suburban. The Raleigh Street ADU had an entrance off the alley. In fact, they're often referred to as alley homes. My district has one alley. As much as we've talked about respecting different neighborhood characters, I keep hearing echoes of one size fits all. So I have a great concern that as much as the plans express a commitment to preserving unique character, the recommendations and strategies inexorably may point to an outcome that will homogenize our unique and distinctive neighborhoods. Suburban context areas can absorb more growth and density, and my constituents, in fact, look forward to seeing, for instance, more commercial density. As the drafts acknowledge, suburban areas are characterized by these different types and uses, having their distinct areas within the neighborhood. My concern is that these plans, with their lack of sufficient specificity, will open the door to disorderly change rather than in those areas where infrastructure is in place to handle it. So it is with an abundance of concern and caution that I will be voting no. My vote does not reflect disagreement with the plans overall, but is cast because of the very few areas with which I have an irreconcilable concern. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Flynn. Seeing no other comments on this one before we vote on comp plan, I just want to say I'm really excited about comp plan. I know a lot of the talk gets on to blueprint very quickly, but comp plan is, I think, one of the most exciting planning documents that I've ever seen. I think it's really cool to see how we talk about climate, how we talk about equity, how we talk about our city in that document. And I think you just did a really amazing job with the comp plan part of it. So I'm going to speak specifically to that because that's what we're about to vote on. So I want to say thank you to everybody who stuck around this long to finally see us vote on something here, but also to just say that I, in particular on the comp plan piece, I'm really excited about this document. So Madam Secretary, roll call on the comp plan as amended.
Black.
Aye.
Brooks.
Aye.
Espinosa.
Aye.
Flynn.
No.
Gilmore.
Aye.
Herndon. Kashmann.
Aye.
Kniech. Lopez.
Aye.
New. Susman.
Aye.
Mr. President.
Aye. Madam Secretary, please close the voting and announce the results.
11 ayes, 1 nay.
11 ayes, 1 nay. Council Bill 302 has passed as amended. Councilwoman Susman, now will you please put Council Bill 303 on the floor?
Sure. I move that Council Bill 19-0303 be placed upon final consideration and do pass.
Thank you, Councilwoman Susman. Councilman Kashmann, would you like to formally offer your amendment to Council Bill 303?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the Council Bill 19-303 be amended in the following particulars. On page 2, line 1, strike April 10, 2019, and replace with April 23, 2019. And on page 2, line 2, strike number 201900013 and replace with number 201900013A.
Thank you, Councilman Kashmann. It has been moved and seconded. Comments? Councilman Kashmann.
Thank you, Mr. President. I won't repeat my lengthy remarks, but as stated before, the purpose of this amendment is to allow for inserting a sentence on page 27 under the vision introduction.
Thank you, Councilman Kashmann. Madam Secretary, roll call on the amendment.
Black.
Aye.
Brooks.
Aye.
Espinosa.
Aye.
Flynn.
Aye.
Gilmore.
Aye.
Herndon.
Aye.
Cashman.
Aye.
Kniech. Lopez.
Aye.
New.
Aye.
Sussman.
Aye.
Mr. President.
Aye. Madam Secretary, please close the voting and announce the results.
12 ayes.
12 ayes. Council Bill 303 has been amended. Councilwoman Susman, we need a motion to pass as amended, please.
Certainly, I move that Council Bill 19-0303 be placed upon final consideration and do pass as amended.
Thank you, Councilwoman Susman. Comments by members of council on 303? Councilwoman Susman.
Oh, thank you very much. Really enjoyed the discussion about Blueprint and having all the people that were on the task force with me come here tonight. I mean, it was just amazing. Joel Nobel and Kimball, of course, Kimball Crangle, but Margie Valdez, hadn't seen her in a while, Gabriel Galome, Perry Burnett, Paul Aldretti, John Desmond, Caitlin Quander. It was, well, I don't want to miss anybody. Stuart Tucker was here, but he didn't get to talk. Jeff Walker, Heather Noyes, Angel. I mean, it was like old home week having you all here. I mean, we did this for 3 years, meeting regularly, and got to know these folks pretty well. The amount of work that went into this on the part of the staff was just incredible. But also the volunteers. There's so many volunteers that just gave up their time to do this, and certainly the recounting of our task force meetings was really very authentic, where people would, we didn't always agree with each other, but we certainly found a way to craft what I think is a lovely plan for land use, and I will be voting for this tonight, and I want to thank all those who were on the task force for everything they did and for how much they taught me. And how much the staff taught me too. It was, I really think I should have a few hours of college credit for it, but nobody gave me a test. So, but it was wonderful. Thank you for the experience.
Thank you, Councilwoman Susman. Councilwoman Kniech.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank the staff. I don't know about other council members, probably all of us, but I personally sent you dozens of edits to the various plans, and I appreciate that almost all of them were made. The few that weren't, you explained to me why, and I followed along with those sticky notes. It is a new standard, someone suggested. It's a very high one, but I was able to track where and why changes were made through the versions, and so it was a really extraordinary process. I feel the need to chime in, not because there's a lot new to be said about the plans, but because I feel like it's important to speak to those constituents who asked me to vote for delay and why I'm not able to do that tonight. I read everything I got, and almost universally, the requests for delay were based solely on timing and not based on specific language in the plan or something that they were concerned about or articulated that they would like to be different. So I would say, okay, so what is it you would like to be different? What do you think a new council or a new mayor would add or take away? What would change? And the I did not get that detail. In comparison, those who wrote me or communicated their support listed out very specific things in the plan that they thought were urgent and needing to move forward. I mean, folks who've heard me talk before know that I don't count up pros and cons. So we had more pro speakers tonight. If the con speakers had been persuasive to me that there were specific things either missing or wrong that we would do differently, that would have been important to me, and it wouldn't have mattered if there were 3 of them and 100 of the others. I want to share, there's just 2 exceptions, and that was, the folks from Washington Park, West Wash Park did identify a couple things about concerns that they didn't want to take on more missing middle and concerns about the ADUs. And I guess that I would say that this is where I point to the good news and the bad news, and this is to Councilman Flynn's point, the plan is not self-executing. And so it's good that it's not if it were self-executing, we would have taken 13 years and everything we would have done in the beginning would have been moot. So you have to do this in phases. You have to start with 30,000 feet. And of course, 30,000 feet never has as much certainty as 10,000 10,000 feet. So I just want to highlight, this was well covered by others, but for me, what I can't wait on is the vast majority of communities that are seeking more access to ADUs. I believe there's a way for the implementation conversation to handle areas without alleys differently. And I believe there is an ability to handle some of those other pieces. But I've been asked for that since I took office. And so to delay that simply because other folks asked for delays that we gave them does not, to me, make a compelling case. Secondly, the equity pieces. I used to be an organizer, and I used to work really hard in year-long planning processes to get a sentence on affordable housing, 1 sentence, so that I could then come back and lobby the council to implement that 1 sentence when some rezoning happened later. I can't believe the level of integration of equity in this plan. And I will be there holding you very responsible to all the implementation. As the staff already knows, I asked for an FTE count on how many folks will be moving over to implementation. I want to get right on the large redevelopment question. So I think that to me can't wait. I can't look at constituents who are saying to me, don't let the big zoning happen, don't let the big redevelopment happen without equity, as they were here doing was that just last week on 40th, 2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago.
They were just here saying, don't let this keep happening. And this plan says you now have the legal authority to do something different in the zoning process, which is a big deal. We always get really strict rules about the zoning process. Now it says no big rezonings without that. I can't in good conscience not move that forward immediately so that the implementation can begin. And if there's a wholesale change in this council and the mayor, there will be, decades of area plans to alter each piece of this. I believe that I heard enough public support from diverse enough individuals, both based on racial backgrounds, neighborhoods. We had far northeast here all the way to Cap Hill and other, very different neighborhoods, Heather Noyes. There are some folks here who are not easy folks to talk about development and change, not to pick on you, poor Heather, but we've had some intense, these are not easy folks who came up here saying they have high standards for this city, and I've seen them oppose things as well. So that tells me that I think no matter who's up here, we probably have the support we need. But for me, I want to put on the record, I will be supporting this tonight based on those reasons, and I want to thank each and every one of the individuals who spoke today and who were involved over the past years. You did far more work than I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Kniech. Councilman Espinosa.
First, I want to acknowledge the incredible effort that went into the documents under consideration tonight. The effort was both necessary and worthwhile. I particularly want to thank David Gaspers for thoughtfully considering and appropriately incorporating any and everything District 1 introduced in shaping the final outcome. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge the work of CPD because as far as a plan at this altitude, 30,000 feet, this plan articulates a bold consideration of many of the concerns I have expressed from this dais over the course of this, my first and only term as a district representative. I know District 1 has had among the most robust input on these plans and their vision, and their vision and desires are well incorporated into these documents and have made them far better. I am going to ask that you understand that my comments are not a rejection of what has been done, but what is needed to advance it. What I feel this plan is missing is the how. The how is the key element and is the source of much of my consternation, or much consternation by many, myself included. While there are many related and valid concerns, many of which were shared tonight, my vote tonight is about what is missing, the how. I recognize the how is the role of other tools other than comprehensive planning documents, but for many communities, for many years, this plan, Blueprint Denver, is most, I edited and I still screwed up this sentence, and I don't even know what I was trying to say. But for many communities, for many years, this plan, Blueprint Denver, is most directly responsible for accommodating growth. And will be the only guiding, that's what I'm getting at. This will be the only guiding document for those communities for years. Especially in Northwest Denver, where 3/4 of our neighborhoods, statistical neighborhoods, do not have small area plans and never had. Therein lies the problem for me. Much of the displacement and gentrification in our communities isn't just a condition of market conditions, but how those forces interact with our land use policy and the tools available to our communities to shape those policies. And just as this plan clearly acknowledges and documents not all communities are equal, or as the plan reads, neighborhoods with more resources often are able to have stronger voices in negotiations. Equity includes a community's ability to comprehend plans, a community's expertise to use and challenge plans, and the time and financial resources needed to ensure that the quality of life they aspire to have can become reality. For example, last Monday night, we approved the rezoning in Northwest Denver at the corner of 32nd and Shoshone and Highland. With the guidance of Blueprint Denver, the existing one, was in direct conflict with the neighborhood's desires, leaving the neighborhood to negotiate with Denver Housing Authority, the developer, to get a win-win outcome. In this case, the community had the resources and expertise to negotiate a desirable outcome for the residents most impacted by that rezoning. The adoption of this plan, Blueprint Denver, will have a direct impact on rezonings in my neighborhoods for years to come, in communities with means and communities without, and that's true for all of Denver. Why this matters is that this plan, more than anything else, maps a way to capture substantial increase in population, allowing for significant density to permeate most, if not all, communities. The justification is supposed to be driven by the 6 vision elements, but most fall outside the scope of city reviewers. If staff struggled to keep track of customized zoning that typically had hard-coded requirements, how are they expected to define something as subjective as these vision elements in real time? That's where the discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots will continue to play out, fueled by the capacity goals in these plans, trying to capture density. God help those underserved communities that are the next Jefferson Park. See if the development community cares if they run roughshod over you. The ones that do are the exception, not the rule. With the implementation plan listing timeframes in years, and most neighborhoods as far as a decade, and some neighborhoods as far as a decade out from neighborhood planning, there is too much vulnerability built into this document. Blueprint Denver should have language identifying items for immediate implementation. It should have had concurrent text amendments to the zoning code to add safeguards to vulnerable communities, particularly the former areas of stability. It should mandate the use of customized zoning or overlays created after this plan's adoption, as a requirement on all map amendments, aka rezonings, in communities that without adopted neighborhood plans, or if the adopted neighborhood plan is less than 12 years old, or older than 12 years old, I should say. Given these concerns and the items I mentioned which are lacking, I cannot support this adoption and the unintended consequences it will have on our communities without means. Density without the tools to address the totality of the plan vision elements will transform today's vulnerable but desirable low-income communities into low-hanging fruit for profit-motivated speculators to build disposable, fee-simple unit or market-rate towers and get out. Paving the way without concurrent regulatory guardrails is environmentally irresponsible and intergenerationally unjust for all Denverites. I wish we could take a few weeks to author text amendments to Blueprint Denver and the zoning code to mandate CPD-led, customized zoning for vulnerable neighborhoods or those statistical neighborhoods that have never had plans and now have mapped high-density place types without prior direction. These would be critical to advance the objectives of this plan. Lacking this important safeguard against unintended consequences, I will be voting no for this document as is. I do, again, genuinely appreciate all the hours of the committed hard work of those involved, residents, stakeholders, and most importantly, David, Sarah, and your colleagues. To get this far in this process and craft what is, in all honesty, a remarkable, truly remarkable plan. So I'm sorry, I won't be voting in favor, but it is a wonderful document nonetheless.
Thank you, Councilman Espinosa. Councilman Brooks.
Well, I will. And I want to say, I was looking at Karen Champagne's shirt. It says Denveright, and I got so tired of looking at that thing in the DMV when folks would be outreaching to our office and we would be inviting people to come to meetings and 3 people would show up and we would send emails out to our entire list in 17 neighborhoods in District 9 3 years ago and 2 years ago, and not a ton of engagement. And so, for the individuals who have emailed me and called me and asked for a delay, I think we got to do better as a community. Yes, there's always things that we can do from the government side to improve our outreach, and I think community should push us to improve that outreach. But I attended the meetings. I sent the emails with no replies back. I met with community activists and organizers and R&O leaders and nonprofit leaders and asked them to be a part of this, to no avail. And still pushed CPD and make sure that there was equitable outreach, make sure that we were going to hard to reach communities and pushing the envelope. And I think part of the reason is we're under a lot of pressure here in Denver. There are a lot of pressing issues. And if there was a drainage project, an I-70 project, I could get 100 people in the room. But if we're talking about who we're going to be in the next 20 years, I only get 5 people in the room. And so there's some challenges, and there's enough to go around. But I needed to acknowledge that as a leader in the community and say we all need to do better around that. The other thing I want to say is, I've been doing some projects for 8 years and have never been able to look at the legal criteria that says, hey, because your community suffered redlining and they did not lend to African Americans in this community, we can now do equity. We had to make that up. I couldn't say that in front of our attorney. Now, today, we can, as a part of what we want to see in building inclusive cities in this community. And so I'm going to be supporting that on removing not just barriers of race, but gender as well in this city is incredible. I hear this more than anything else. There's 3 things why I'm voting for this. Actually, I'm voting for this because it meets the criteria and all that kind of stuff. But these specific issues have come from the community, both from activists, organizers, nonprofit, R&O community. Equity, We want that to be a number one issue. Intersectionality. Stop just thinking about zoning. Think about parks. Think about transportation. Think about economics. The intersectionality of what happens in our city is in this plan, and it's powerful. And that was touched on tonight, but I want to just be specific and explicit and say intersectionality in what we do is very important. And then the growth. Growth is such a big topic. We're talking about it all the time. We're afraid of it. We don't know what to do with it. And the thing that I've been encouraging folks is this is an excellent way to see what to do with growth, and it's about harnessing it in the right specific areas of the city. And I think we've done a really good job of that. So I'll be supporting this. Government doesn't stop for elections. And I want to say that explicitly. We don't stop for elections. There are over 10,000 employees who are not elected and work their butt off every day. And I just want to say hats off to you all. I'm sorry you're caught up in all of this craziness. It'll be over hopefully in 15 days or whatever. But thank you for working so hard in the midst of all of this as staff folks. And I know you've been through a lot through the community, but we see you and we appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Brooks. Councilman New.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to say thank you again for the quality of the work you've done. I enjoy so much to hear all my colleagues, and I hear the people in the audience saying implementation. That's so key. That's the quality of a plan, the way we all feel about it, when you can say, let's do it. Let's go ahead and implement. So I just want to thank you again for setting it up to such a high level of quality that now we're ready to say, let's go do it. So I just want to encourage the mayor. I know the mayor probably loves this plan as much as everybody here. And as we go through the planning and for the budget process, we'll be thinking about resources for next year. But also we need to be thinking about, just like we did for this planning process, we need to be thinking about the next 20 years of the financial resources we need to implement this plan, as well as address all those key issues we've got. We got huge, as we've mentioned, affordable housing, transportation, homeless problems that we're going to require a lot of resources that fit into this plan, like Albus said. So I just want to encourage the mayor to take this plan and be ready to implement it and do what he can to bring us all together to see how well we can develop this city. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman New. Councilman Kashmann.
Thank you, Mr. President. For me, three things come to mind that haven't ever been said in any plans I've read. It's never said equity. I mean, it seems like a duh. It must have been, but it was never held out as a value before. And it still isn't in the plan until we adopt this. For the first time in any plan in the history of Denver, it talks about that on all of our streets, the safety of pedestrians and pedestrian movement is paramount. And for me, I'm a fan of ADUs. Now, I don't read Blueprint saying that there's going to be ADUs in every yard. It holds up ADUs as a value to be considered on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And that's going to be an important discussion. So I think to delay this endangers the well-being of our citizens. So I'm very much looking forward to moving this forward.
Thank you, Councilman Kashmann. Councilman Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to add a few comments in here. I do understand, to not feel and see the pressure in Denver is to really not see and feel the pressure of people in Denver and what they're facing. And I think it's critical that we don't dismiss that, but we realize that that is a true issue. And as Denver is growing by leaps and bounds, we have to address it. But we cannot do it in a way that is irresponsible. And I say irresponsible because a lot of the things that we're facing don't just happen through zoning. You cannot fit, things have to match up. When I first took office, we were in the midst of a recession. Nobody was building. we were about to embark on the 2010 rezone, the whole city. And here I was, a brand new city councilman. I gotta admit, I didn't know very much about zoning, but I learned quick. And we made the right moves. We made the right moves for the time, because during that time, so much pressure was on West Colfax and some of these areas, and we actually downzoned. We downzoned from R2 to R1 with ADUs. We did ADUs before it was cool. Only 2 were built, but we did ADUs before it was cool. And now you see where the dividing line is, and you see all the development that's going on. It's right there along 12th in Villa Park in the west side. However, because of a lack of being able to have something a little bit more descriptive and customized, we now have people who live in very tiny homes on big old lots, and new folks coming in can't afford to actually live there because it's a small house for $500,000. It straddles old redlining. If you go north of Colfax, everybody's property values are hunky-dory. If you go south of Colfax, you'd think it's 2 different cities. That's redlining, ladies and gentlemen. That's not neighborhood boundaries. Those are all red lines. So as much as we really like and love our neighborhood boundaries, we got to think beyond that. We got to think fluid. We got to redefine neighborhoods in our own minds, and how we approach this with the plan, and how we use this plan in the future. It is a guide, right? It isn't the end-all, be-all. It is going to take political will from the next council and a heck of a lot of leadership to get us to where we need to be. I say that because, and this is not to slam anybody, the staff at Denveright did an amazing job of keeping us abreast of everything, of every step that we were making. And the first step, the first meeting, remember the first meeting? I was like, hey, wait a second, where are we having these meetings and where are we not having these meetings? You skip West Denver. It's, oh, no, we got it covered in quadrants, so we can't think of the city in quadrants. The west side, we should be having a meeting here at Corky Gonzalez Library. That turned out to be one of the most fruitful meetings for this whole process. And the majority was done in Spanish. This will help us guide what Denver's growth will look like, how we manage it. And I talked about the role of government and leadership. You have to push your representatives to make sure that they understand what your definition of the role of government is. And that it's okay to wander into the forest there. I wasn't really aware of where we were headed in the district until, and understanding this plan and understanding our future until some friends came over from a bigger city. And we went to go watch the Raiders-Broncos game. And they said, oh, you live downtown. Man, I live on 7th, and I live on 7th and Knox. I said, no, I don't live no downtown. Oh, yes, you do. It's right there. You live downtown. In our city, you live downtown. And I thought to myself, you know what? I kind of do live downtown. Compared to Flynn land over here, I live downtown. Because that is total, Pinehurst, that area, the good Costco, that one, that's the suburbs. We are downtown compared to that. And when we looked and when we had these conversations in our community, in our neighborhoods with this plan and these maps, well, why the heck do we only have single-family homes right here? Right here by the light rail. Can we pick it up a notch? And if we don't do something about it, the free market will. And they're going to make a patchwork quilt out of our neighborhoods. So if we don't lead, If we don't have a plan, then we will have a plan to fail. And so we cannot afford to fail. And that, I'm sorry to go off here, but we have to have a plan. And this plan can be amended. This plan can be revisited. It is nimble. It is fluid. It can be changed. And it should be. But it cannot be successful if you don't have a budget to fully fund our staff, so that you have planners that are going to be working on these neighborhood plans and implementing these neighborhood plans. We can't just say, hey, Sarah, come over here. Hey, we can't split people in two. You saw this, Chester, when you were on staff. It was so hard, Stephen Chester. I call him Chester, Stephen Chester. But you know how amazing that Westwood neighborhood plan was? For the first time in a plan, we used the word Mexican with pride to describe Westwood. We actually called out Little Saigon, and they talked about cultural centers. And that's the kind of work it's going to entail. But you have to have a fully functional, budgeted staff that matches the resources of what's in front of it, right? Or the resources to match the staff and the desire. You have to have leadership from our council, and you have to start thinking about community benefits. Every step we make, we have to ask ourselves, how does this benefit the community? And what can we use from these developments to help come back to the neighborhood? How can we use these developments to help come back and benefit the community? So that's where I'm headed. I am supportive of this because I do believe in a plan and not a plan to fail. The last thing I have to say about timing, I understand it. But I cannot go back to Westwood and to the West Side, to all those folks that organized and spent years on this in their own communities, taking time off of their jobs, real jobs, cleaning our buildings, building our city, teaching our kids, just so they can come and volunteer and be part of this, to say, oh, wait, it wasn't implemented. It reflects, yes, a lot of our staff time, but a lot of people in the community that chimed in. And with that, I will support this moving forward. So,
thank you, Councilman Lopez. Councilwoman Gilmore.
Thank you, President Clark. I will be very brief. Thank you, Sarah and David, for all of your work. We had a great participation in Far Northeast. I think it maybe had a little bit to do that we had a neighborhood plan that we were really excited about, but the engagement, the outreach, and how we are honoring the thousands of hours of work of not only city staff, but registered neighborhood organizations, businesses, nonprofits in the area. And, you know, I agree with Councilman Kashmann. I have not read equity in very many city plans. And I know that there's an urgency to, if this passes tonight, jump right in and start implementation. But I think it's really important to call a pause for just a brief moment, because we don't want to recreate the same systemic root issues that got us into this situation before. And so I have to call out and give kudos to community planning and development staff, because the work that you're committing to do around implicit bias training, looking at, you know, systems of institutionalized racism, that's big stuff. That's a big, big deal, especially to a predominantly African American and Latino community that I represent. And by you engaging them and us tonight having two strong community leaders, Angel Fother and Pam Giner, here to testify their support of this plan, that's another very, very big deal, because they know their stuff. They've lived in the community for many years, and I just want to acknowledge that, and that, you know, going forward, I would like to see that evaluation, that checklist tool, so that we can continue to have that transparency within the neighborhood, so that they can see how you're evaluating plans and how decisions are being made. And Kimball and Joel Joel, thank you as well to your work, and I look forward to supporting this plan tonight. Thank you, President Clark.
Thank you, Councilwoman Gilmore. Councilman Herndon.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, I remember that first meeting years ago when I had an infant, and now I have a very rambunctious, nearly 4-year-old. Cannot say thank you enough for everyone. As Marybeth talked about, to be in a room with just thoughtful, innovative, brilliant people for years was just truly remarkable. To go out to the community members and hear their sentimental, there is. When I hear the comments about people were unaware, you just weren't paying attention, because I don't know what more we could have done to connect with the community. Because if you look at the maps, we touched every neighborhood. We reached out in multiple ways, several different facets, and so just cannot say thank you enough for that. And to see this final product is truly remarkable, and we know the work's not done. And I want you all to continue to hold us accountable to make sure that the city is moving forward with the implementation with the vision that the community created. But I'm very excited about the future, and I'm excited to vote on this. So let's get this done. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman Herndon. With that, I'll just close by saying, a plan that took as long as it took to get here. I guess it's appropriate that we're taking this long during a council meeting to get to a vote. Councilman Herndon was talking about remembering that first meeting. I was just trying to remember the beginning of this meeting. I will not rehash what everyone said up here. I just really want to say thank you. Thank you to staff. Thank you so much for the hours and hours of work in the community, the hours and hours of work with my constituents. Thank you to all of the task force members and all of your unpaid hours and commitment to this city and to this process. This plan is what it is because of all of you. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Madam Secretary, roll call on Blueprint Denver as amended.
Black.
Aye.
Brooks.
Aye.
Espinosa.
No.
Flynn.
No.
Gilmore.
Aye.
Herndon.
Aye.
Kashmann.
Aye.
Kniech.
Aye.
Lopez.
Aye.
New.
Aye.
Sussman.
Aye.
Mr. President.
Aye. Madam Secretary, please close the voting and announce the results.
10 ayes, 2 nays.
10 ayes, 2 nays. Council Bill 303 has passed.